Well, hey folks, welcome back to GB102 Bible Backgrounds. In this module, we're going to discuss two major aspects of the Old Testament. One is this period known as the exile. The exile technically starts at 722 BC when the Assyrians deport the northern kingdom of Israel. But that's the technical term. Most people start calculating the exile around 605 when the first people from Judah are taken to Babylon for their extended period of exile. Now, while the Babylonians and the Assyrians will be the people groups that are responsible for bringing about the exile of the Jewish people, we're going to see that this other people group from across the Zagros Mountains, the people known as the Medes and the Persians, are going to play a significant part in this history, especially after 539 BC, when the Persians and the Medes become the dominant empire, even displacing the Babylonians and the Assyrians as the dominant world power in the ancient Near East. So, if you guys are ready, I'm ready. Let's go hit the trails and let's see what we can find out about this period we know as the Jewish exile. So, to begin with, let me just say for the record that with maybe the exception of the Exodus, the exilic period is the most influential and formative period on Israel's development, that their religion becomes what we would call Judaism today. In fact, when we start talking about people that we would call Jews, this term itself even begins to be used during the exilic period. And so in many ways, the exilic period takes the Israelites, who were monotheist in name, but not really in practice, that after the end of the exilic period, we start to see a Jewish religion come from this, that the religion of Israelite Yahwism has become codified, it has become very rigid, and basically we can start to talk about this religion that we would call Judaism starting really around this period. That before, while we do have a continuity with the law of Moses and the prophets, we don't really have the people of Judea following one single monolithic religion. After the exile, we do. And therefore, we need to spend quite a lot of time just kind of explaining how did this transition go, where we had the Israelites who were very prone to compromising with paganism, to the Jews post-exile who are very sold out on this idea of monotheistic worship of Yahweh. So one of the things we have to begin that kind of starts this process is that in 586 BC, the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem is destroyed. And when this temple is destroyed, it's going to raise all kinds of questions for the Jewish people. And that they're going to specifically be asking both from their prophets, from their priests, and their leaders, just how are we going to deal with this change? That all of a sudden we don't have a temple, we don't have a king, and we don't even have our land anymore. Everything we've had that the promises of earlier Israelite religion was based on are now gone. And how do we adapt to those issues? And so we'll take each of those issues one at a time, but let's begin by dealing with the issue of the land and the promises to Abraham. So of the three questions that are driving the theological reflection of this exilic period, probably the biggest is the question of land and the promises to Abraham. Back in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, we've looked at this numerous times throughout this class, but let me just emphasize again that God promised to Abraham that he would give him descendants, that he would make a covenant with him, that through Abraham's seed or descendants, all nations would be blessed. And part of that blessing is that the children of Abraham would possess the land that God showed Abraham, this land that we call the Levant. So all of these places that we've been looking at throughout this class all center around this land that Israel was given as a gift. Well, with the destruction of the temple in 586 BC, we suddenly have a major crisis that God had given this land to Abraham's seed as a promise, and now it looks like that promise has been nullified or voided out. And the question for the Jewish people was going to be, how is God going to be faithful to this promise? You see, they knew enough about God that he was faithful always to his promises. And so the question for them theologically is, if they lost their land, how would God bring them back to the land and give it to them as an inheritance once again? Now, in addition to this question of land, we have the question of the kingship. Around 1010 BC, David became king over all of Israel. And in David becoming king, he will get this idea that he wants to build a temple for the Lord his God in Jerusalem. Well, he is going to be denied the privilege of making this temple, but through the prophet Nathan, there is going to be a promise to David that God would build David's kingdom and that it would last forever. Specifically, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 16, give the promise that one of David's offspring would sit on his throne forever. Well, from 1010 BC all the way to 586 BC, we have a solid line of kingship that someone in David's immediate family is taking over every generation. But with Zedekiah, the last of Israel's kings, we see this collapse of this promise to David. And so, if you're a good Jewish person thinking through the problem of the exile, the other kind of cognitive dissonance you're dealing with is that you are looking at passages like 2 Samuel 7, and you see this word forever, that there is going to be someone reigning on David's throne forever. And you start to ask the question, how is it that God is going to be faithful to this promise when at the moment there is no king, no descendant of David on the throne? And so the Jewish people are going to begin to speculate, how is God going to restore David's monarchy? And they're going to come up with some pretty interesting ways to solve that dilemma, but that question is going to be very real. How is God going to remain faithful to this promise to David, even though currently during the exilic period, the kingdom is destroyed? And so the last of the major questions for this exilic period have to deal with the end of the exile itself. Now, Jeremiah chapter 29, we see Jeremiah writes a letter to this first group of exiles that go out into exile in 605 BC. And Jeremiah writes them a letter basically saying, here's what you're to do now that you are captives in the land of Babylon. Now, interestingly, starting in verse 8 of chapter 29, Jeremiah starts to predict that there's going to be a 70-year period of captivity. And so this is going to make the Jewish exiles begin to kind of ponder in their heads, well, 70 years from when? From 605? From 586 BC? And what does he mean by the end of the exile? And so as people begin returning to Jerusalem, they're going to be looking back to this prophecy from Jeremiah, and they're going to be asking the question, how is God going to end this exilic period? And this question is going to become more and more pressing to the biblical writers the closer we get to those deadlines where we just don't have any more years to give. And then they're going to start asking the question, is the 70 years a literal 70, or is it a figurative 70? Now, the book of Daniel gives an interesting answer that it's going to be 70 sevens. And it doesn't say what those sevens are. Some people translate that as weeks. Some people translate that as 70 or 70-year periods. There's many ways that can be reconstructed. But the bottom line is that after the 70 years, the exile only somewhat ends. Less than 10% of the Jewish people will return to the land of Judah and to the city of Jerusalem. And this will open up the question, how will God be faithful to this promise to end the exile as he promised by the prophet Jeremiah? And to these three questions of the exile, we should probably add a fourth one, and that is the destruction of the temple. As we looked in our last lecture, we talked about the priest and the types of sacrifices that they were to offer. And those sacrifices had a very specific job. They were often to atone for sins, to purify the people, and to cleanse them whenever they became in some way contaminated, either by sin or by some other form of spiritual ailment. Well, how will Israel continue to worship when the temple is destroyed, when the priests are off in exile? And this will become a very real soteriological problem for Israel. How do you carry on the work of atonement without things like an altar, without a temple, and without the Ark of the Covenant? For example, Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16 says that after the Babylonians are done, the Ark of the Covenant will be no more, and no one will know where it is after this point, indicating that at least for one of the major festivals, like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, that there won't even be a place to go into to put the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat, on the tip of the ark itself. And this raises all kinds of questions. How can we obey the law of Moses without a temple or without a tabernacle? And again, the prophets during this time period will come up with some interesting solutions. Probably the most interesting is Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, where the prophet basically says, the problem we have here is that the old covenant is so broken, it can't be fixed. The only real solution is a new covenant, which, of course, another word for covenant is testament. And this is why, of course, Christians to this day use the term New Testament when they refer to the new covenant started by Jesus, that they are invoking this idea from Jeremiah that the old covenant is irredeemably broken, and the only solution is to start a new one. Now, during the exilic period, many people are still going to continue writing scriptural works, that we will have prophets that will write prophecies. We are going to have historians who will describe the historical events of the return. But for this lecture, I would like us to focus specifically on the book of Daniel, because the book of Daniel offers an interesting challenge that, unlike some of the other literature that's produced during the exilic period, the book of Daniel really doesn't follow any major rules of genre. In fact, it has several types of genres within that book, making it very complex. But I would also like to suggest that the book of Daniel is a microcosm of just the entire exilic problem, that all four of those issues, how is God going to return the people to the land? How is he going to rebuild the temple? How is it going to redeem the Davidic monarchy? How are we going to return to the land and fulfill the promise to Abraham? All of these questions are asked time and time again in the book of Daniel, and some of the answers are rather provocative. But let me just kind of approach this from the get-go and say that when it comes to the book of Daniel, part of what makes it so confusing is that it doesn't contain just one type of genre of biblical literature. In fact, I would go so far as to say it contains 5: hagiography, a historical narrative, sections of dream interpretation, apocalyptic prophecy, and predictive prophecy. So let's take each of those sections apart here. What is hagiography? Well, that's just a fancy Greek word for a type of literature that talks about saints. The primary goal of hagiography is to tell people who think that saints are pretty nifty and would like to be one, well, here's what some of those saints did, and if you find yourself in a similar situation, here's what you need to be doing. And so one of the primary concerns for the book of Daniel is that they will be asking the question, how is a good Jewish person to remain a faithful observer of Moses' law and the covenant while they are in exile? How can they remain devoted to the Lord while they're living in a pagan land? And the answer that the book of Daniel gives is that it will offer snapshots from the life of Daniel and his three friends, and that they will specifically show, instances where they were able to stand up and not submit to the pagan culture. Now, three good examples can be in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his friends refused to eat the non-kosher foods. In Daniel chapter 3, Daniel's three friends refused to bow down to the king and worship, or specifically to worship his idol that he's created. And in Daniel 6, Daniel himself refuses to bow down to the king of Persia. And so in all three of these cases, we have an example of what we would call hagiography. We see good people giving good examples, and that anyone who reads this document will say, oh, that's what I need to do the next time I find myself between a rock and a hard place kind of situation. Now, the second genre that we find in the book of Daniel is we see just accounts that we would call historical narrative, that especially for the first 6 chapters, we see accounts of Daniel and his friends living in the land of Babylon and giving kind of a play-by-play, here's what happened to them first, here's what happened to them then, here's what happened to them next, and then finally, here's what happens to Daniel later in his life. And just like the books of history, the book of Daniel will continue this tradition of offering religious critique of rulers. But instead of critiquing Israel's rulers, they now don't have any, that they're going to critique Babylon's rulers. But they're going to continue critiquing them based on God's standards set forth in the law of Moses. So, similar to these books, the kings of Babylon are going to be shown to be powerless against Israel's prophets. That just as we saw with kings like Ahab, kings like Zedekiah, that they may try to stand up against Israel's prophets. They may even try to throw them into prison or execute them. But the kings of Babylon will be shown in the book of Daniel to be just as powerless against Daniel and his friends as the kings of Israel were powerless against previous prophets. And so in many ways, the book of Daniel has similarities to what we would call the former prophets in the Hebrew canon, that we are specifically showing a historical narrative with the purpose of critiquing rulers based on the law of Moses. Now, an interesting and, dare I say, unique aspect of the book of Daniel is that we are going to see dream interpretation throughout this book. And the reason dream interpretation is interesting, at least it's interesting to me, is because we don't see too many Israelites who specialize in dream interpretation. In fact, I can really only think of 3 specific Israelites who have a tradition of interpreting dreams. Joseph, the son of Jacob, Daniel, and the prophet Zechariah, a little bit later in the exile, are really going to be the only 3 major prophets who consistently use this idea of dreaming dreams and then trying to interpret dreams in order to get glimpses of either the future or to critique the present. And of all of these people, the book of Daniel puts the most priority on Daniel's ability through God's intervention to be able to understand and interpret dreams with a high degree of accuracy. And so this is going to make Daniel, of all the prophetic books, unique in that it will record dreams, both Nebuchadnezzar's and Daniel's, but it will also offer interpretations of those dreams. And this will be different from books like, say, Zechariah, where we have the dreams that are listed, but no official interpretation given. And it will be different from earlier people like Joseph, in that Joseph really only interprets a few dreams that we have recorded, whereas Daniel will do it with a high degree of frequency. Now, if the book of Daniel wasn't already interesting enough, once we get to chapter 7 of Daniel, the book will take a shift from talking about things historically to specifically focusing on the prophecies of Daniel. And so, like many of Daniel's predecessors, Daniel will have a high degree of accuracy in predicting future world events. And he'll predict some major events, such as the conquest of Babylon by the Persians, the rise of the Greek kingdoms, and many will even see him successfully predicting the rise of the Romans after the rise of the Greeks. Now, there's going to be an interesting twist on this, though, that when Daniel was predicting things in the far future, the book of Daniel will also apply specific time frames to these prophecies. In short, he'll give kind of a countdown, or this will be completed by certain time. And so this will make Daniel also very unique among prophetic literature, in that it will be some of the most exact prophecies with terms of not just event and fulfillment, but also predicting a when and how of these prophecies. Often this will be some of the more controversial aspects of the book of Daniel, because it's one thing to predict something in a vague way and then have it come to pass. It's another thing to say this will happen after so many years and have both the event happen and the timing be exact. And in fact, this will be so exact, it will start to have, this will be the book of the Bible that will have some of the more interesting questions when people start reading it and critiquing, was Daniel really that accurate? And speaking of those people, let's just take a look at one of those. During the 2nd century AD, this is the time after Christ, we're going to see a philosopher by the name of Porphyry. He's going to come down the pike, and he is going to be looking at some of the claims that the book of Daniel makes. And he's going to just kind of shake his head and say, no, I really don't think Daniel was that accurate. No one can be that accurate. At least that's the way Porphyry's thinking. And instead, he's going to say that Daniel is actually written after these events happen, and that he is predicting this stuff after the fact. A later person talking about Porphyry will quote some of his writings. Here's one from Jerome in his commentary in the book of Daniel. Quote, Porphyry wrote in his 12th book against the prophecy of Daniel, denying that it was composed by the person to whom it was ascribed, but rather by some individual living in Judea during the time of Antiochus IV. He further alleged that Daniel did not foretell the future so much as he related the past, so that whatever he spoke of up until the time of Antiochus IV contained authentic history. So, if I could paraphrase that here, basically Porphyry says Daniel is so accurate, and its prophecies and its timing are so concise, it's easier, basically if we're using an Occam's razor type argument, to say that Daniel was written after the fact by people who simply knew all the dates, knew all the facts, and then wrote about it in an interesting or prophetic way. Now, of course, this is going to be the challenge that we as conservative evangelicals find with the book of Daniel. If you're like me, I don't have an issue with prophecy being predictive or accurate. And so the challenge of Porphyry really is in many ways a challenge to, the authority of Scripture and the authority of God to reveal to human beings the future before it happens. But the conclusion of all this problem is that today, when it comes to scholars looking at the book of Daniel, the dominating question, the question that every academic is asking when it comes to this book, is the question of, did this happen during the Persian period, during the exilic period, or did it happen during the Greek period, during that infamous 400 years of silence, sometime around 160 BC? And, that's a big difference when you're going the 550s BC to the 160s BC. That's almost a 400-year difference. But this is often going to be the distinction between conservative interpretations who side with Jewish and Christian traditions that say that this book is written by the historical Daniel in the 6th century BC, a Persian exile, Daniel versus liberal interpretations, which tend to side with Porphyry, and they reject the idea of predictive prophecy, or at least predictive prophecy with a high degree of accuracy. And because of that, they will choose to say Daniel was written long after the fact, and he's not predicting things, he is simply writing about it in a poetic or prophetic way. Now, if all of this wasn't interesting enough, Daniel was going to add one more log to this fire, and that the book of Daniel will introduce to biblical readers a new genre of biblical literature we haven't seen before yet, a genre we would call apocalyptic literature. Now, this kind of literature comes from a Greek word. It comes from the word apokalypsis, which basically means to reveal something that is hidden. Now, this is a literary genre that uses imagery, and it specifically uses imagery to obscure or mask the reference, so that basically you're trying to mask the true nature of the subject you're discussing. Basically, we are talking in a double entendre. Now, in the biblical canon, the exilic books of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah will all contain examples of this apocalyptic literature. Now, in the New Testament, we really only have one book that we can call apocalyptic literature. In fact, its title, The Apocalypse of John, or better known as The Revelation of John, does contain this form of literature as well. But the book of Daniel, especially if you go with an early date for this book, is one of the first major and clear examples of apocalyptic literature. Now, the presence of apocalyptic literature presents a very interesting problem, especially when trying to put a date on the book of Daniel. You see, while Daniel may be one of the first books to use apocalyptic literature, during the Greek period, especially during the 2nd and 1st centuries, we start to see a lot of Jewish people writing in the apocalyptic style. And they're specifically writing in this style because they are resisting the Greeks, either the Seleucids up in the north in Syria or the Ptolemies in the south in Egypt. And in both of these cases, what we are seeing is that this apocalyptic literature is made to basically form a necessary hiding place for, we'll call it, disruptive literature. That the Jewish people are writing things that, if they fell into the wrong hands, would get them in a whole lot of hot water. That they are basically saying, this king is evil, this king's policies are wicked, and therefore we have a right to rebel, we have a right to challenge it. Or we can even say further that one day our God will destroy all this and put it in its rightful place. But this, of course, creates an issue. How do you write to other Jewish people and tell them that this is going to happen without, getting your head cut off if the wrong authorities get a hold of your letter? And the answer is you write apocalyptic literature. You hide your meaning behind symbols and metaphors. The people who are on the inside, of course, understand the metaphor very clearly. But the people who are on the outside do not. And this is going to be the challenge of interpreting apocalyptic literature, is that once you get several generations removed from its original audience, that we lose the key to interpreting what did each of these symbols mean. And that's the rub. The people in the first generation who received this letter knew exactly what the symbols meant. It was kind of code speak for what they were dealing with. However, generations later, and with the code not being restated, interpreting such literature becomes very, very difficult. And so when it comes to interpreting apocalyptic literature, there's really two different theories of interpretation on how do you go about doing this. And the first of these theories and this is probably the most popular among scholars, is to assert that apocalyptic literature is always addressing the concerns and the problems of the age in which it was written. And of course, when this happens, this forces scholars to look for potential reference during the actual time of the author themselves. And so when it comes to the book of Daniel, conservative scholars are going to be looking specifically, how would a person living in Babylon or Persia understand these symbols? If you're a liberal, you're probably looking much more later into the Greek time period, but you're still asking the question, how would someone during the Greek time period understand these kind of signs and symbols? Now, a second interpretive theory, and this is one I don't think is as helpful, is to say that apocalyptic literature is obscure predictive prophecy, and that it addresses a time very far and distant from the author. And while I don't deny that certain aspects of Daniel do have predictive prophecy, that all of these aspects are interpreted by Daniel or by God or an angel for Daniel. Whereas in normal apocalyptic literature, there is no interpretation. We are just simply given a symbol and we are trusted that we will understand what it means. But if you go with this second interpretive theory, this will force scholars to look for reference in very different time periods. Now, one of the dangers, I think, of this second issue, or the second way of interpreting, is that it will encourage scholars throughout history to basically say, see, this apocalyptic prophecy is being fulfilled right here and right now. And what we're going to see throughout the course of the last 2,000 years is many people have picked up the book of Daniel and they've said, see, this was fulfilled here, this was fulfilled here. But the problem is there's very little agreement among these scholars on what was actually fulfilled by what and when. So you need to keep all three of these ideas about Daniel in mind, because once we start getting to scholarly textbooks and specifically scholarly commentaries on the book of Daniel, because there's these two different interpretive methods, what we're going to find is that three major interpretations have come about for the book of Daniel. The first of these interpretations are going to be that they're going to see most, if not all, of the apocalyptic material in the book of Daniel as discussing the Maccabean revolt. Now, conservatives are going to say that this is predictive, that Daniel was predicting this back during the Persian period. Liberals are going to say that it was after the fact, but in both cases they're going to say that we're looking for reference in the Maccabean period. Now, early Christian interpretations are going to see most or all of this material as discussing the Maccabean revolt up to the coming of Jesus Christ nearly 200 years later, all the way to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And personally, I think that this has the most biblical credit just because in the New Testament, Jesus will frequently quote the book of Daniel, and he'll say that some of this apocalyptic material is specifically talking about me and my ministry, or about things that are near to come in the future. Now, recently, within the last 120 years, basically since the publication of what we call the Schofield Study Bible, dispensational Christians have chosen to interpret this apocalyptic material as discussing reference way far in the future, maybe even like to modern times. And so people that take this form of interpretation will be reading Daniel and specifically trying to ask the question, is this abomination that causes desolation something that is going to happen, maybe even in the near future? Well, since I know you're paying for my opinion, here's my opinion. Personally, I think most of the Daniel apocalyptic literature took place at or before 70 AD. And I usually say this just simply because it makes the most sense of Jesus' own teaching, that he specifically was given directions and commands to Christians to leave Jerusalem when they see something happening during their lifetime. And in fact, something did happen during their lifetime. In 66 AD, we see the Romans start to surround Jerusalem, and by 70 AD, they've destroyed the city. And many early Christians did take Jesus' advice, and they left, and they said, woo, I'm glad we did that, because otherwise we would have been destroyed. But it's an interesting question. And the book of Daniel, for better or for worse, has become a very large centerpiece of Christian theology. So now that we've got all of those preliminaries out of the way, let's shift gears and let's talk about the Persian Empire for a second. Now, the Persian Empire is going to grow very, very rapidly. And part of the reason for their success is they didn't have to build the empire from scratch. When the Babylonian Empire fell, the Persians were in a prime position to just simply take over what was already there. And so when the Persians come into Babylon in 539 BC, they will take over all of Mesopotamia, they'll take over all of Syria, they'll take over all of the Levant, and they'll just continue running Babylon's empire business as usual. And so while they will add new area, they'll conquer parts of Asia Minor and Egypt and make the empire even bigger, not to mention places even to their east, such as Bactria and the Indus Valley. The Persian Empire's core, the area that we would call Media, Persia, and Babylon, will be the center of their empire, and that was already founded by the Babylonians. So in many ways, when the Persians are coming into this area, they're going to take over an empire that already exists, but then they're going to build on it. And they're going to build on it in very impressive ways. And this empire, unlike the Babylonian Empire, which really only lasted from about 609 BC to 539 BC, the Persians are going to last for several hundred years, from 539 BC to 330 BC. And so we're going to have numerous Persian kings that are going to rise and fall during this time. And many of them are going to play an important role in the biblical narratives. And so here for the rest of the lecture, I'd like to just spend some time and review what some of the contributions these various Persian kings made to the biblical text. So as we start talking about Persian rulers, the big one we have to start with is Cyrus the Great. He's going to come to power over Media and Persia in 559 BC. But 20 years later, he's going to really kind of set his mark on history by conquering the Babylonian Empire, thus fusing all the Persian and Median claims with the Babylonian Empire, creating a huge base of operations from which to work. Now, the biblical texts always speak very fondly of Cyrus. It's weird, for a pagan king, he comes across as probably the best spoken person throughout all of Israelite literature for being a non-Israelite. And just to give some examples, in Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, Cyrus is mentioned by name. Now, if we go by a conservative estimate, this means that Isaiah, sometime around 700 or so BC, is predicting that about 160 years later, that this person named Cyrus is going to end the exile and send the people of Judah back into the land of Judah. Now, firstly, that's pretty impressive that he gets the person's name right, and that this person will do so. But what makes it even more impressive is the language that Isaiah uses here. Specifically, Isaiah will call him God's anointed one, or Messiah. And so we will start to get this idea that a Messiah is somebody who leads God's people out from their exile. That this will be one of the major expectations of any Messiah that is to come, is that they must do something drastic to end the exilic period. Now, the book of Daniel in chapter 5 is going to predict Cyrus's rise, but he is also going to predict that the actual city of Babylon is going to fall under one of Cyrus's generals, a guy by the name of Darius the Mede. And because these predictions are so accurate, many Bible commentators, even to this day, are going to say, you know what? I think this was written after the fact. So if you see anyone talking about things like a second Isaiah or a third Isaiah or the Greek writer of Daniel, what they're getting at is that they don't believe in predictive prophecy. And they're basically saying that these kind of prophecies had to happen after Cyrus did his thing. Well, I personally think that God can show a prophet the future in such a way that they can predict something even of this magnitude. But we cannot doubt one way or the other that Cyrus plays a major role in this restoration of the Jewish people. Now, the book of Ezra and the end of the book of Chronicles both mention that Cyrus the Great makes a proclamation that allows Israel to go home. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any other surviving copies of this proclamation outside of the Bible. But they have found many writings that Cyrus did write. And probably the most famous is what we know as an archaeological artifact known as the Cyrus cylinder. And this is basically a large proclamation. It's on a clay cylinder that you can roll on a clay tablet and thus basically make many copies of this proclamation. But this proclamation basically comes from Cyrus and gives people in the land of Babylon permission to go to their ancestral homes and rebuild their temple, and specifically so that they can be praying and offering sacrifice for the new Persian leadership. And so while this isn't proof that he made this specific kind of a commandment for the Jewish people, it is proof that it is something Cyrus would do. And so many commentators have pointed that this shows that Ezra and Chronicles are highly reliable documents because they line up with things that we know Cyrus has done historically in the past that we confirm with extra biblical literature. Now, when this happens, according to the book of Ezra, that Cyrus will appoint a descendant of David, a man by the name of Zerubbabel, to carry out the task of rebuilding the temple. And this is a process that's begun in 538 BC, and it will continue all the way to 516 BC, which incidentally is 70 years after the destruction of the temple. But all of these things considered, just keep in mind that when we talk about Cyrus the Great, this is one of the few times where we have a pagan king that gets very good press from the biblical literature. Now, while he's not really mentioned by name in the scriptural text, the events of Cyrus's successor, a man by the name of Cambyses II, are going to be very formative to this Persian period of Jewish reclaiming the land, because the Jewish people are going to come to Jerusalem, they're going to start rebuilding the temple, but they're going to find a new group of people that are living just to the north of them, a group of people calling themselves Samaritans. Now, the Samaritans are going to come and approach the Jewish people, and they're going to say, hey, we all worship the same God, right? Why don't you let us help rebuilding this temple? Well, for better or for worse, Zerubbabel and his associates are going to say, no, this is a pure-blooded Jewish thing only. No other people need apply. And so when that happens, when they are snubbed, the Samaritans will team up with the Ammonites and the Arabians, and they will start to create political antagonisms against the Jewish occupation of Jerusalem. And they'll specifically be antagonizing in such a way to try to encourage the Persian kings to come back to Jerusalem and destroy it all over again. Now, the result of all that is that the building of the temple from about 530 all the way to about 520 is just going to come to a screeching halt. And it's only really once Zechariah and Haggai, some of the last prophets of the Old Testament, begin preaching and doing their work, will the rebuilding the temple process resume. But keep all of this in mind, that when you read through books like Ezra and Nehemiah, that we are frequently covering very large amounts of time. Just already within the first couple of chapters of the book of Ezra, we've covered the ascension of Cyrus and followed through to Cambyses. And there really isn't a lot within the text to show exactly how much time has passed. But be on the lookout for those sorts of things. Now, after Cambyses, there's going to be a period of unrest, followed by another Darius. A guy named Darius the Great is going to come to the throne. And after this, he's going to make the Persian Empire about as big and as great as it can get. In fact, he's going to make it so big and great, he's going to start coming into contact with the Greeks on the coast of Asia Minor and on the Greek mainland, what we would today call Achaia or Macedonia. And because of this, the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states are going to begin skirmishing left and right, back and forth, basically from the 480s all the way until the 330s and that's BC, by the way. And so what's going to happen is under Darius's rule, we'll basically go from having small skirmishes to a full-blown invasion of Greece. Now, keep in mind, these invasions will never be fully successful. Sometimes they'll conquer large areas of territory. Sometimes they'll burn major cities like Athens. But the Persians will never fully conquer the Greeks. And the Greeks will remember this. And then eventually, by 330 BC, a man by the name of Alexander the Great is going to come storming back, and it will put an end to the Persian Empire. Now, another major thing that will happen during Darius's reign is that in 516 BC, they will finally complete rebuilding the Jewish temple. And so at 516, one of the major questions of the exile will have a temporary answer. That with the rebuilding of the temple, the Jewish people can once again offer sacrifices to the Lord their God. Now, when it comes to discussing the legacy of Darius the Great, one of the big questions that comes up is, how influenced by Jewish writings and Jewish thinking and Jewish religion was Darius the Great influenced? And the reason we have to ask this is because one of the major monuments Darius left is this large inscription called the Buhistan inscription. And in this inscription, Darius claims that he worships a single god. He's a monotheist, and he claims to worship a god by the name of Ahura Mazda. Now, this is part of a monotheistic religion of Persia known as Zoroastrianism, and it gets its name from Zoroaster, or a prophet by the name of Zarathustra. And because of this being one of the few monotheistic religions in the ancient Near East, many scholars have started to wonder, did these Persians get these ideas from the Jews, or did the Jews get their fully monotheistic ideas from the Persians? Which came first, chicken, egg? And to be honest, was there any connection between the two at all? Now, I will admit, during this time period of the Jewish exile, many adjustments to Jewish theology do, in fact, happen. That the Jewish people finally start acting like the monotheists they were called to be all the way from the time of Moses. Additionally, the Jewish people will start to develop a very strong sense of angelology and demonology. They'll start naming their angels. They'll start naming their demons and giving them roles and jobs that they're doing in the world. And probably most interesting to this study, that the Jewish people are going to really develop a strong call for this idea of the resurrection of the dead, that they're really going to kind of focus in and hone in on the idea that for God to be faithful to all these promises will require him to raise the dead back to life. And as many commentators ever since the 1700s have been pointing out, that the worship of Ahura Mazda of the Persians also has very similar things, that these are monotheists. They have a very well-defined angel and demonology. They believe in the resurrection of the dead, and they believe that there is an eternal paradise for the good guys. And so this has caused many people to wonder, what came first? Now, again, because you're paying for my opinion, I personally think a lot of the Zoroastrian writings were influenced by Jewish thought. I think that the Jewish thought came first. And part of the reason for this is we just don't see many things written down about the Zoroastrian religion until much, much later. And if I'm willing to bank which one came first, I'm going to simply say, well, which one do we have proof in writing? And the answer is, the Jewish writings are much, much older. Now, after Darius the Great, we are going to see his successor, a man by the name of Xerxes I. He rules from 485 BC to 465 BC. And Xerxes is going to be a major player both in world history and in various narratives of the Bible. Now, most scholars believe that Xerxes has a Aramaic name, Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus, and that this is the king of the Esther narrative, that this would be the Persian king who marries the Jewish woman by the name of Esther. Now, if you happen to be a movie-going person like I am, you may have seen a certain horrible movie by the name of 300, And you would notice that the king Xerxes is pictured in a, well, rather stylized way as shown in the picture here on the slide. I'd like to kind of break you from getting any history from movies, to be honest, but one of the things that I would like to point out is that the pictures of Xerxes that we do have more resemble the picture on the left, that he looks like an ancient Near Eastern monarch. Long curly beard, long curly hair, very much a clothed person. But Xerxes is going to use his ever-increasing power and influence, and he too is going to go to war against the Greeks. And once again, like with his father Darius the Great, Xerxes is going to be fought to a standstill. He'll win some battles, he'll lose some battles, he'll stalemate other battles. But the bottom line is going to be that the Greeks and the Persians are going to basically say, we've got a stalemate. Persians, you can have Asia Minor, but we Greeks, we are going to have the land of Achaia and Macedonia. And those are going to be pretty much the definitive battle lines, pretty much from the 460s BC all the way to the 330s BC. Now, also during the time of Xerxes, we're going to see a second wave of people begin returning from the Jewish exile. And this wave is going to continue long after, even into Xerxes' predecessor, Artaxerxes I. And so the two big waves we probably want to talk about here is the return of Ezra, the scribe, somewhere around 458 BC, and the return of Nehemiah, somewhere around 445 BC. Now, what we find here is that this Persian king, Artaxerxes, is very well disposed to both of these men, and he's willing to give them both political power and access to funds from the treasury in order to help their rebuilding projects. And so Ezra will start religious reforms in Jerusalem once he arrives, and Nehemiah will take political leadership and will do things like rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. Now, both Ezra and Nehemiah are known for being Jewish reformers, but they are going to have specific interpretations of the law of Moses that is going to favor what we call radical racial isolation. That from this moment on, that the Jewish people, as part of their identity, is not just going to be monotheistic. Their identity is going to be, we will not marry outside of our own Jewish culture. And so this is going to be in accordance with several laws from the law of Moses that we saw, like, for example, Deuteronomy 23. You're not allowed to marry a Moabite or an Ammonite, and if you do, well, that their children can't be considered Jewish people for at least 10 generations. Ezra and Nehemiah are going to go even further. If you've got any non-Israelite blood, you're out, period. Get lost. And so part of the reason they're going to do this is because they're asking the question, how do we make sure we never ever go into exile again? And their simple conclusion is going to be, we follow the law of Moses. We got into trouble before because we didn't follow that law. To prevent another tragedy, we will follow the law of Moses full tilt, no questions asked. Now, as Christians, this creates a rather interesting problem for us, though, because many of the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah are very difficult to harmonize with the teachings of Jesus. Simply put, Jesus will look at the way that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, people that would see themselves as following in Ezra and Nehemiah's footsteps, that Jesus will take a look at their practices and he's going to say, you know what? You guys are so worried about following traditions that you're really neglecting the law of Moses. Now, of course, if you ask a Pharisee, do you follow the law of Moses? And they'll simply start reciting the Torah. They will basically say, of course we're following the law of Moses. And so one of the interesting things to do when you come to reading a lot of this Persian material is to run it through what I call a New Testament filter. A lot of people, when they see Ezra and Nehemiah, they say, well, these are obviously reformers that are doing good, and we tend to read them as heroes. However, try reading them as villains sometime, or at least try reading them as misguided kind of pharisaical groups that basically said, you know what, we're going to follow the law, and you know what, if we got to break some eggs, we got to break some eggs. And I think that this is a very interesting and often necessary hermeneutic, because when it comes to New Testament Christianity interpreting these books of the Bible, frequently we find that their reforms just are not compatible with the teachings of Jesus. And so this is going to bring up some very interesting questions for us as we continue our study. And so that's going to wrap up this lecture here. Let's give two major conclusions here. The first conclusion is that during the exilic period, the reason there was so much substantial formation of Jewish religion is because they're wrestling with four major questions. How is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham? How is God going to fulfill his promises to David for an eternal kingdom? How is God going to end this Jewish exile and bring all the people back to Jerusalem? And fourthly, how will this worship of God continue now that the old covenant has been damaged or even broken, or worse, destroyed? And so all four of these questions are going to be running through the minds of good Jewish people, and the writings during this time that wind up in the books of the Bible: Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Haggai, Malachi, Zechariah, Daniel, Ezekiel. All of these books are going to be focused on trying to answer these questions. And so that's my encouragement for you here as you read through some of these parts of the Bible. And because they're in the middle, they're probably some of the books that you're not as familiar with. Take time to actually ask the question, how does this exilic book begin to reflect on the problem of the exile? Some will suggest that the way forward is new covenant, new theology, and God doing something totally brand new. Some are going to reflect and say, we got to get back to the law of Moses. We got to go all the way back. And you know what? It doesn't matter who gets left behind. We've still got to do it. And so we really kind of have this tug of war that some of the Jewish people are going to be looking for a return to the old ways. And some of the Jewish people are going to be looking for God to do something brand spanking new. And both of these problems are going to come running full tilt into the New Testament era, where Jesus will address both of those issues directly.